Hi everyone, Petey here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we'll be covering how to periodize and progress plyometric training to reach peak performance when it counts. Let's first establish what we mean by plyometric training. Plyometrics are simply exercises which rely heavily on the stretch shortening cycle. In particular, we generally refer to plyometrics as exercises which use the lower body and primarily the calf muscles and tendons. This is because these tissues play an important role in athletic qualities like jumping and sprinting. If we watch someone sprinting or jumping, we can see that the ground contact times, meaning the time the foot is in contact with the ground, are very short. This study showed that some of the world's fastest sprinters have ground contact times of between 0.07 to 0.09 seconds during maximum speed running. This means that with each stride, the foot only stays in contact with the ground for less than 0.1 seconds. Since it can take nearly 2 whole seconds to reach maximum force output, there is simply not enough time to exert very high forces during maximum velocity running. This is where plyometric training and the stretch shortening cycle comes into play. Plyometric training can make the stretch shortening cycle more efficient so that more force can be applied in a very short period of time. Plyometrics will also train timing and coordination so that the force can be applied at exactly the right time during ground contact. We will now explore how plyometric training can be periodized throughout a year to reach peak performance when the athlete needs to perform at their best. When periodizing any athletic quality, we want to use more general methods of training further away from the time we need a peak, and more specific training the closer we need to peak. This is because specific training will have greater transfer to sporting performance. So for plyometric training, we will start with more general forms and transition to more specific methods. Apart from volume, the primary component that can be periodized with plyometric training is the loading or the speed of the stretch shortening cycle. The more load that is used, the slower the stretch shortening cycle will be, whereas the lower the load is, the faster the stretch shortening cycle will be. If an athlete is using plyometrics in their training, they will likely be using it to enhance jumping or sprinting performance in their sport. Almost every running and jumping sport involves unloaded movements rather than loaded. Therefore, the most specific form of plyometric training we can do is unloaded plyometrics. The other component that can be periodized is unilateral and bilateral training. It could be argued that unilateral, meaning single leg training, is more specific to sport performance than bilateral, meaning double leg training, since running and changing direction are purely unilateral. However, there are still instances where athletes need to perform movements using both legs. For example, vertical jumping during sport often involves propulsion from both legs together. Therefore, it is my opinion that both unilateral and bilateral plyometrics should be included at all times throughout the training year. This way, we get some variation in loading and movement skill, which acts in some way as an undulation of plyometric qualities. Therefore, the factors we will periodize for plyometric training will be loading or velocity. As previously mentioned, unloaded plyometrics will be more specific to sport performance and should be performed closer to the athlete's peak, while weighted plyometrics should be performed further from the peak. An example of how plyometric training twice per week can be periodized over time may look something like this. In the early stages of preparation, or when the athlete is far from when they need a peak, they may perform exercises such as weighted depth jumps. On one day, this may be bilateral, while the other day might be unilateral. The emphasis of this exercise is to aim for maximal height rather than maximal speed, which will emphasize the force output more than the velocity of movement. There will still be a stretch shortening cycle component to this exercise, although it will be a slower cycle and have longer ground contact times. When the athlete is closer to when they need a peak, but not immediately prior, Exercise selection may involve weighted jumps and bounds with a focus on short ground contact times and fast movement. Although the athlete will focus on moving fast, the stretch shortening cycle will still be slightly slower than unloaded movements since additional weight is being used. The force requirements are higher, and more inertia needs to be overcome on the landing and propulsion of each contact. Once again, this can be undulated throughout the week, with one day being bilateral and the other day being unilateral. Finally, when the athlete needs to be at their absolute peak performance, we can use the most specific forms of plyometric training. This may include unloaded exercises such as classic bounds and jumps, with the intent of spending minimal time during ground contact. This will be very similar to the loading and speed of the stretch shortening cycles seen in sporting practices and competition. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.